My name is Heather Ogilvie, and this is the Human Truths Podcast, Scotland edition. This series about Scotland has been percolating within me for a long time. I've felt Scotland reaching a place where the old conversations are no longer enough, where emotions run high yet clarity continues to be strangely absent. And I want to create a space where we can speak honestly about this country, without rushing to drown out each other's voices with aggression or emotional overwhelm, without conclusions based on desires, not facts, without falling into the familiar patterns of political noise, and without assuming that identity alone can carry us into the future. For me, Scotland isn't an abstract debate. It isn't a symbol to be waved around or a storyline to attach ourselves to. It is part of my family, part of my history, part of how I understand myself in the world. I come from Clan Ogilvie, and our roots reach back into the 12th century to Gilbert, son of Gilbride, Earl of Angus, who was granted the lands of Ogilvie by King William the Lion. That is where the name began. And over time, the family became woven into the story of medieval Scotland in a way I've always felt exceptionally proud of. Two sons of Sir Patrick de Ogilvie supported Robert the Bruce during the Wars of Independence. One of them, Robert de Ogilvie, is described in historical records as one of Bruce's firmest friends. I've always found that association incredibly moving, not for its drama, but for its simplicity. A firm friend of Robert the Bruce. A firm friend is someone who stands beside you when the situation demands courage, clarity, and loyalty. My family fought at Bannockburn. They lived through the uncertainty and the hardship of those years, and they understood in a very real way what sovereignty required. Our Ogilvie clan motto in Latin is a fa, which translates to the end. It is a small phrase that carries a great weight of responsibility. It speaks to endurance, loyalty, patience, and the willingness to see things through, even when the path is long. And for me, being the end of my branch of this family line gives those words a deeper meaning. It brings legacy closer. It raises the question of what we leave behind in the places that shaped us. And it spurs me to speak up, to voice clearly and proudly that Scotland deserves more than promises and stories. It deserves truth, clarity, and the kind of leadership that plans for generations, not headlines. My own family story reflects something many Scottish families have lived through. My great-grandfather left Scotland as a young man because the family farm near Carnoustie couldn't support 4 sons. There simply wasn't enough land, enough money, or enough opportunity to keep everyone here. My father brought us back to this extraordinarily beautiful country of my heritage in the 1980s, returning to the place that always felt like home, no matter where in the world I lived or travelled. But that story of my great-grandfather leaving out of necessity and our returning out of belonging has always stayed with me. It has taught me that love for Scotland and the ability to thrive in Scotland are two very different things, and both matter. And this is at the heart of why I'm making this Scotland-focused series. We hear a great deal about pride and heritage and identity. We hear a great deal about what Scotland might become or what it once was. But we hear far less about the reality of the existing practical structure underneath all of that. The financial backbone that keeps a country functioning. The systems and institutions that make sovereignty possible. And the real economic pressures that shape our choices, whether we acknowledge them or not. Independence is often spoken about and posed to the citizens as a simple choice, underscored with immense emotion and passion. But it is also a system, a responsibility, and a financial undertaking. The union is often described as a comfort or a constraint depending on who is speaking. but in reality it is a framework that carries significant financial weight on Scotland's behalf. And Scotland's future, whatever form it takes, needs to be understood in the context of truth rather than hope alone. My intention here isn't to persuade you of anything. It isn't to ask you to choose a side or align with a party or to commit to a particular outcome. My intention is much simpler: to explore the financial, emotional and structural realities that Scotland must understand if it is ever to choose its future with confidence. I want us to be able to have the kind of conversation that respects the country as it is, not as we imagine or hope it will be. I want us to talk about the things that shape prosperity and security in a calm, clear way, with honesty, with curiosity, and with enough maturity to hold complexity without collapsing into slogans or even slangs. This series is my way of beginning that journey. Steadily, openly, and in the spirit of my ancestors, Afa, to the end. Now that you know a little about who I am and why Scotland matters to me, I want to talk about the purpose of this series. What it is, what it isn't, and why I believe we need to have this conversation now, rather than at some later moment when decisions have already been made for us. I want us to explore Scotland with a kind of steady honesty that has been missing from public life for a long time. Not the kind of honesty that is sharp or accusatory, but the kind that allows us to see clearly, to understand ourselves better, and to speak about this country with the respect it deserves. Because when you strip away the emotion and the noise, Scotland is facing a very simple question. What would it take for us to stand on our own feet financially, structurally and emotionally, and what would we need to build before sovereignty, which is a way deeper concept than just political independence, could ever be a real viable choice? This is where I think the national conversation has drifted into shadows. Some people, particularly people in government, talk about independence as if it was a switch you flick, or a moment of heroic triumph, or a return to something ancient and certain. But independence is not an event, it is a system, it is an infrastructure, it is a set of responsibilities that must be carried with competence, stability, and foresight. It demands institutions that are ready, a tax base that is strong enough, a welfare system that is affordable, and leadership that can hold the weight of a nation without collapsing into performance or ideology. We often talk about the Union as if it is a cage or a comfort, depending on who is speaking. But the reality is much more complex than that. Right now, Scotland is financially protected by the UK. There are risks we do not carry alone. There are shocks we do not have to absorb by ourselves. There are costs that are spread across a much larger population and a much larger economy. This isn't a judgment, it is simply the truth of the current structure. And if we ever want sovereign choice, we have to understand what this protection actually means, what would replace it, and how long would it take to build something capable of standing independently. So this series is not about telling you that independence is the right or wrong answer. It is about asking deeper questions so we can evaluate the idea with clarity rather than just emotion. It is about understanding what sovereignty requires. It is about being honest about where Scotland is strong and where we are exposed. It is about acknowledging that capability must come before freedom, otherwise freedom becomes something fragile or impossible rather than empowering. And it's not just the financial side. Sovereignty has an emotional dimension as well. It asks us to grow up as a country, to move beyond the binary narratives we've inherited, to see ourselves as capable of building systems and institutions that last. It asks us to look at our political culture, at how we lead, how we make decisions, how we share truth with the public, and decide whether this culture is strong enough to carry the responsibilities of an independent state. If it isn't, we need to understand how to evolve it. This is why I want to explore ideas like leadership reform, competency requirements for government roles, long-term planning horizons, transparent reporting, and the need for a non-political council of experts to guide national decisions. These are not ideological positions. They are structural necessities for any mature country. They are part of the foundation that has to be in place long before sovereignty can be contemplated seriously. Throughout this series, we're going to walk through the building blocks of a functioning nation: money, taxation, welfare, land, energy, public services, governance, education, health system, and the emotional maturity that sits beneath all of it. We will look at what Scotland already has, what are we missing, and where are we leaking value. We will look at the pressures that are rarely explained publicly and the opportunities that are often ignored. My aim is that by the end of this journey, independence or remaining in the Union stops being a question of identity and becomes a question of capability. A question we can answer from a place of understanding rather than hope or fear. This is about equipping ourselves with the truth so that whatever Scotland chooses in the future, it chooses from a position of strength. Before we go any further, I want to pause and clarify something that is at the heart of this entire series. We hear the word independence constantly in Scotland. It has become a shorthand for identity, for hope, for frustration, for possibility. But independence on its own is not the full picture. Independence is the political moment, the vote, the legal separation, the constitutional change. It's a step, it's a choice, it's a line drawn in time. Sovereignty, however, is different. Sovereignty is the capacity to function as a country in a stable, confident, and self-reliant way. It is way deeper, way more demanding, and considerably more structural than the word independence. Without sovereignty, independence becomes an emotional event rather than a durable reality. And I'm not talking about sovereignty from kings and queens. I'm talking about sovereignty, the definition. Where independence is about separating, sovereignty is about standing. A sovereign nation can raise enough of its own revenues to fund its public services. A sovereign nation can borrow at sustainable rates because lenders trust its institutions. A sovereign nation can absorb economic shocks because it has reserves and fiscal depth. A sovereign nation has strong leadership, long-term planning, credible governance systems, and the ability to negotiate on equal terms with other countries. Independence can be achieved overnight. Sovereignty cannot. Sovereignty takes years of preparation, institution building, truth-telling, and disciplined leadership. It requires transparent finances, mature political culture, and the emotional steadiness to make decisions that may not feel exciting, but are essential for long-term stability. Right now, Scotland is being invited into a conversation about independence without the groundwork for sovereignty having been laid. And that is the piece that concerns me. Not because sovereignty is out of reach, but because the work has not been started with the seriousness it deserves. At the moment, Scotland does not and cannot fund all of its own public services. It does not carry certain risks alone. It does not have the institutional architecture, a treasury, a fully functioning debt office, a central monetary framework that sovereign nations need. This does not make us weak or incapable. It simply reflects the reality of being part of a larger economic union for over 300 years. And this is why we need to talk about sovereignty openly, calmly, and without political bias or pressure. Because if Scotland does ever choose independence, it should be able to do so from a position of readiness, not hope. And while Scotland remains in the Union, it should still seek to strengthen its sovereign capacity inside that relationship. Because capability is value whether independence happens or not. So when you hear me use the word sovereignty, I'm not talking about symbolism or sentiment. I'm talking about the practical foundations that allow a country to stand securely on its own feet. And that distinction, sovereignty versus independence, will guide every conversation we have in this series. Before we go any deeper into Scotland's financial position, I want to pause and explore a simple but often misunderstood idea: what sovereignty actually means. We hear the word all the time, in debates, in headlines, in passionate conversations, but very rarely do we unpack what is behind it. And I think if we're going to talk seriously about Scotland's future, we need to step into this question and look at it without the noise. Independence, or now sovereignty, as I describe it, is often spoken about as pride or identity, or the right to make our own decisions. And those are emotional truths which matter. But there is another side to sovereignty that is far more demanding. Sovereignty is a responsibility. It is a financial and structural undertaking. It is a promise that a nation can stand on its own feet, support its people, absorb shocks, and manage its affairs without depending on someone else to steady the ground beneath it. A sovereign nation has to generate enough money to fund everything that keeps a country alive: healthcare, education, infrastructure, welfare, justice, environmental protection, local government, pensions, emergency services, and the machinery of the state. It has to build and maintain financial institutions, from a treasury to a central bank or an equivalent structure. It needs debt management systems, tax systems, auditing bodies, regulators, reserves, and contingency plans for the hard years. And it doesn't end there. Sovereignty also means that a nation must be able to negotiate and honour international agreements, from trade policies to defence arrangements to monetary partnerships. It must be able to reassure lenders, investors, and neighbouring governments that it is stable, predictable, and well managed. Sovereignty has a diplomatic face as much as a financial one. These are the layers we don't often talk about, perhaps because they feel complex or unglamorous. But they are the foundation of independence. They are what transform independence from a feeling or an aspiration into a functioning reality. And this is where Scotland's current situation becomes relevant, because right now we do not carry these responsibilities alone. As part of the United Kingdom, Scotland is financially protected. We share risk across a much larger population and a much larger tax base. We have access to institutions that we do not have to build from scratch. When shocks hit, global recessions, pandemics, banking crisis, the impact is shared across the entire UK economy. Scotland benefits from that stability whether we always notice it or not. None of this means independence is impossible. It simply means independence requires preparation. It requires a staged, thoughtful, well-planned process of building capacity, strengthening institutions, closing economic leaks, and developing the leadership culture that can hold all of this with competence and calm. A sovereign nation needs leaders who understand how systems work, people who have managed organisations, dealt with complexity, and held responsibility for outcomes. It needs long-term planning that stretches over decades, if not centuries, not electoral cycles. It requires a political culture that tells the truth even when the truth is hard, because national confidence is built on transparency, not wishful thinking. That is why in this series we will explore ideas like requiring government leaders to have real-world experience, creating professional qualifications for governance, and establishing a non-political council of experts to guide the country through the decisions that shape our long-term future. These aren't ideological suggestions, they are part of what sovereignty demands. A country cannot lead itself well if the people in charge have never led anything before. A country cannot build stability if its planning horizon is 4 years long. A country cannot build stability if its key leaders change roles every 6 to 12 months. A country cannot inspire trust if it hides its financial realities from its own citizens. Sovereignty asks us to grow up as a nation, emotionally, financially, and structurally. It asks us to move past the romanticism of flags and the defensiveness of identity debates. It asks us to become capable of choosing independence as a deliberate, informed, confident decision rather than as a reaction or a dream. And this is at the heart of the question we will keep returning to. What would Scotland need to build, understand, repair, or strengthen before sovereignty becomes a viable option? Not just emotionally appealing, but financially sound and structurally secure. We are not here to decide whether independence is right or wrong. We are here to understand what independence requires. Because when a country understands the requirements, it gains power. The power to choose wisely, to prepare properly, and to shape its own destiny with clarity rather than wishful thinking. And that is where we will go next. Scotland within the UK and what financial protection actually means. Now that we've begun to clarify the difference between independence and sovereignty, I want to spend some time on the landscape Scotland is operating within right now. Because if we're going to have an honest conversation about our future, we also need to have an honest understanding of our present. And one of the most misunderstood aspects of Scotland's situation is the level of financial protection we currently receive within the United Kingdom. This isn't about opinion or politics, it is simply the design of the system we are a part of. For over 300 years, Scotland has shared economic risk with the rest of the UK. We contribute to a large common tax pool, and in return we receive public spending that reflects Scotland's needs, geography and demographic pressures. No single part of the UK stands alone. The entire idea of the Union is shared financial responsibility. Right now, Scotland benefits from what is called risk pooling, the ability to absorb economic shocks across an entire population of nearly 70 million people rather than 5.5. When recessions hit, when global markets shake, when energy prices spike, when inflation runs high, the cost is distributed across a much deeper and broader fiscal base. Scotland does not currently have to stand alone in those moments. And that is what I mean by financial protection. We also receive the Barnett allocation, which determines a significant portion of Scotland's public spending. In simple terms, Scotland receives more per person than England does, because our geography, rurality, and health needs make service delivery more expensive. This isn't generosity, it's a recognition of structural reality. But it does mean that Scotland, at this moment, spends more through public services than it raises in tax revenues, something that would need to be addressed very carefully if we were ever to transition to sovereign funding. Again, this is not an argument against independence, it is simply an acknowledgement of the starting point we are working from. If independence is a future possibility, then the gap between what we raise and what we spend becomes one of the most central questions. How would that gap be closed? Over what time period? Through what reforms, transitions, or new revenue sources? And who would be willing to lend to Scotland in the early years while those systems were being built? These are not emotional questions, they are structural ones. They are the kinds of questions every sovereign nation must answer long before it stands alone. And Scotland deserves to understand them clearly, transparently, without fear, and without fantasy. Part of the financial protection within the UK also comes from the institutions Scotland has access to: the Bank of England, the UK Debt Management Office, the financial regulatory bodies, the Treasury infrastructure, the established credit reputation of the UK as a borrower, and the existing currency system. These systems provide stability that we often take for granted, because they operate quietly in the background. But they are the scaffolding of financial sovereignty, and if Scotland were to leave the Union, it would need to recreate or renegotiate every single one of them, and no matter what the option, it would cost money. This is why I keep returning to the importance of truth. When leaders speak about independence without acknowledging these structural realities, they are presenting an incomplete picture. And the public, those who want to make an informed choice, cannot do so when only half of the truth is laid before them. It's not fair, and it's not responsible. Understanding the financial protection Scotland receives now allows us to ask a more constructive question. What would it take to replace those protections, step by step, with systems of our own, bearing in mind that we need the finances, the systems, and the capability to implement them as part of the transition? What would need to happen to develop a stable tax base, a strong credit rating, a robust set of institutions, and a durable economic plan? What resources could Scotland lean into, and what vulnerabilities would need to be addressed? These are the questions that move us out of emotion and into capability. And as we move forward in this series, we're going to explore them one by one, not to argue for or against independence, but to understand what readiness would look like. Because a country that understands its present can shape its future, and a country that understands its risks can begin to build its strengths. Now that we've begun to understand Scotland's current position within the UK and the level of financial protection that forms part of that reality, we can turn towards a deeper question, one that sits beneath much of the national conversation but is rarely spoken about with any real clarity. What would it actually take for Scotland to become ready for independence? Not emotionally ready, not politically ready, but structurally and financially ready. Ready in the way a sovereign nation must be. Because independence, if it ever becomes the right choice for Scotland, should not be something we leap into. It should be something we grow into. It should be the outcome of careful preparation, not the starting point of it. And if we look honestly at where we are now, several areas emerge that would require real attention and long-term work. The first is revenue. Scotland currently spends more on public services than it raises in tax. This is not a moral failing or a sign of incompetence. It is simply the outcome of being part of a larger fiscal system. But if Scotland were to become sovereign, the gap between spending and revenue would need to narrow significantly. That doesn't mean austerity. It means redesigning our economic model so that more value is created and retained within Scotland, rather than leaking outwards through corporate extraction, land ownership patterns, and energy revenues that do not fully accrue here. The second is institutional infrastructure. A sovereign Scotland would need its own treasury systems, statistical bodies, regulatory agencies, debt management frameworks, and long-term fiscal planning offices. These would have to be built from scratch or adapted from existing structures, and they would need to be strong enough to inspire confidence from international lenders, investors, and neighbouring nations. The credibility of a country's institutions is one of the biggest factors in the early years of independence, and it cannot be improvised after the fact. The third is leadership and political culture. Sovereignty requires leaders who understand systems, not slogans, people who have held responsibility for complex organisations, who can navigate uncertainty, who know how to manage risk and build stability. Part of Scotland's preparation would involve raising the standard of political leadership through experience requirements, professional qualifications, and a deeper culture of truth-telling. Sovereignty cannot be held by individuals who lack the grounding to steward national institutions. The fourth is economic resilience. A newly independent nation needs reserves, buffers, and the ability to withstand shocks. It needs a plan for economic downturns, global volatility, and unexpected events. Scotland would need to grow its capacity to save, invest, and build long-term assets. That includes exploring sovereign wealth strategies, capturing more value from natural resources, strengthening renewable energy models, and reducing dependency on revenue streams that fluctuate dramatically. The fifth is currency and monetary strategy. One of the most complex questions a new nation would face is, would Scotland adopt its own currency? Would it maintain a formal arrangement with the Bank of England? Would it use sterling temporarily while building monetary capacity? Each option has trade-offs, risks, and requirements. The current Scottish Government announced that we would have a new financial monetary system. However, this has massive consequences. So a clear plan, developed well in advance, would be essential for credibility and stability. The sixth is global positioning. Independence involves relationships beyond the domestic sphere. Scotland would need to consider trade partnerships, international agreements, EU membership or alignment, defence arrangements and diplomatic ties. These are not abstract questions. They deeply influence a country's economic confidence. Preparation would involve shaping a coherent strategy for how Scotland positions itself globally and the kind of partnerships that support its long-term prosperity. And finally, sovereignty would require emotional maturity and respect. The ability to acknowledge limitations without shame. The ability to face challenges without retreating into defensiveness. The ability to speak truthfully about what is hard and to build unity without demanding uniformity. A sovereign nation needs a political culture that is steady, respectful, transparent and resilient, not reactive, not tribal, not sensational, not swept up in narratives that simplify what is inherently exceptionally complex. These are the areas that form the foundation of viable independence. Without them, independence becomes fragile, dangerous. With them, independence becomes a choice, an informed, stable, confident choice made from a place of capability rather than emotion. So when we talk about building Scotland's future, this is the work. These are the questions. These are the structures that would give us real options rather than dreams. And the heart of this series is to explore each of these areas, thoughtfully, and with enough mature honesty that by the time we reach the end, independence is no longer a question of how we feel, but a question we can approach with clarity and competence. Because the future of a country cannot be built on sentiment alone. It must rest on understanding. And understanding, when we allow it to guide us, gives us something far more powerful than certainty. It gives us a choice. If we're going to talk seriously about Scotland's future, we also need to talk seriously about the people who would be responsible for shaping it. And this is an area that often gets brushed aside because it feels sensitive or confrontational, yet it sits right at the core of whether Scotland could ever operate as a sovereign nation. The truth is, a country cannot be more capable than the people who lead it. A nation's stability, credibility, and long-term strength rest on the competence, character, experience, and emotional steadiness of those who hold responsibility for its systems. Sovereignty requires infrastructure, yes, but it also requires judgment, the kind of judgment that comes from experience, depth, and genuine understanding of how complex systems function. Right now, Scotland's political culture, like much of the UK's, is built around party loyalty, performance, communication skills and electoral strategy. But the skills required to win an election are not the same as the skills required to transition an entire country into its own sovereign state. Campaigning and governing are completely different worlds. One relies on emotion, momentum and narrative. The other relies on patience, discernment, truthfulness and a capacity to hold steady through uncertainty. If Scotland ever wants to move towards real sovereign capability, even within the Union, we have to rethink who is allowed to lead and how leaders are chosen. And this is where I believe experience matters. I would like to see a Scotland where everyone serving as a government minister, a senior civil servant, or a council leader has at least 10 years of relevant experience in industry or organisational leadership. Experience that is required them to manage budgets, lead people, face consequences and navigate complexity. Experience that teaches humility. Experience that teaches responsibility. Experience that teaches how decisions ripple out into the real world. Alongside that, I believe every senior leader should complete a professional qualification in governance, a structured education in how countries actually work, not just the political side, but the economic, legal, administrative and societal systems that interact beneath the surface. A grounding in monetary stability, tax structures, public finance, infrastructure planning, international negotiation and crisis management. This isn't about elitism, it is about competence. It is about acknowledging that leading a nation requires way more than passion or rhetoric. It requires solid expertise. The same way medicine requires expertise, engineering requires expertise, and teaching requires expertise. We would never let someone run a hospital just because they felt strongly about healthcare. We shouldn't let people run a country without understanding its systems first. Sovereignty demands this. If Scotland does not have leaders who understand the financial, structural and emotional realities of nationhood, any attempt at independence would become unstable. Not because the idea is flawed, but because the preparation is insufficient. And leadership reform is not just about qualifications or experience, it is also about truthfulness. Sovereign nations cannot be built on selective storytelling. They need leaders who will speak clearly about the country's financial position even when the truth is uncomfortable. Leaders who will share annual reports on the real state of national finances, not budget announcements shaped for political advantage, but transparent assessments that the public can trust. Scotland also needs a leadership culture that is collaborative rather than adversarial. I believe a Scotland Council of Leaders, bringing together experts from industry, education, healthcare, infrastructure, finances and public service, would create a level of collective intelligence that is currently missing. It would bring balance, expertise and long-term thinking into the heart of national decision-making, and, importantly, it would reduce the emotional volatility that can come when big decisions are driven by political cycles rather than national needs. Leadership reform also asks us to look at how decisions are made. Major national changes should not be the result of internal party battles or short-term political pressure. They should involve the population directly, through structured, informed referendums much like the Switzerland's model, where the nation participates in shaping long-term direction. Not endless campaigning, not manufactured division, but a genuine democratic mechanism that invites maturity and shared responsibility. This is what sovereignty actually looks like at a cultural level. Leaders who understand their systems, institutions that outlast governments, truth-telling that builds national confidence, and a population that is trusted to participate in shaping its future. If the foundation of leadership is weak, sovereignty becomes impossible. If leadership is strong, competent, and emotionally mature, sovereignty becomes not just viable but transformative. And that brings us to the next part of this conversation, the internal pressures Scotland faces and how emotional realities influence the choices we make as a nation. Up to this point, we've been looking at the financial and structural elements of sovereignty, the external architecture that any nation needs if it's going to stand securely. But there is another side to this conversation that is just as important and perhaps even more sensitive: the human reality inside Scotland. Because a country is not simply its institutions or its tax system, it is its people. And a nation's strength or fragility rests on the well-being, the capacity and the productivity of its population. So, if we're going to talk about sovereignty honestly, we also need to look at the pressures that sit within Scotland's social fabric. One of the most significant questions is employment. Not just how many people have jobs, but how many are able to work, and how many are working in roles that allow them to live with dignity. Scotland has a working age population that is smaller than perhaps people often realise, and a sizable portion of those individuals face barriers such as long-term illness, disability, caregiving responsibilities, or the lingering effects of generational poverty. These aren't flaws in anyone's character, they are the realities shaped by health, opportunity, and the systems we have built around people. But they influence the financial capability of the country in a very real way. When fewer people are able to work, or when work does not generate enough income to support a stable life, the pressure shifts onto the state. Healthcare demands rise, welfare needs increase, community services become stretched, and the tax base becomes narrower, which affects the ability to fund the essential systems that sovereignty relies on. This is not a criticism of those who need support, It is an acknowledgement that Scotland carries a heavy burden of health inequality, chronic illness and deprivation, burdens that have emotional, social and financial consequences. To talk about sovereignty without talking about this would be incomplete. A sovereign nation must be able to support its people, but it must also cultivate the conditions in which its people can support themselves. That leads us to a deeper truth. Many of Scotland's pressures are not purely economic, they are emotional and cultural. Generations of industrial decline, low wages, unstable work, addiction, poor housing and underinvestment have left scars in communities. When people feel powerless or undervalued, it affects motivation, ambition and the ability to participate fully in the economy. And no nation can achieve sovereignty on paper if its people are struggling to find sovereignty within themselves. Another internal pressure is the cost of living. Not the headlines, but the quiet realities of heat, food, rent and transport. These basic needs have become sources of stress for many families, and when essential goods are controlled by companies that extract rather than reinvest, the pressure on households becomes a pressure on the country. A nation cannot grow strong when its people are constantly bracing for the next bill. We also need to look at the structure of Scotland's welfare system. It was built with good intentions and it remains essential for many, but we have to ask whether it empowers people or traps them, whether it helps them move towards contribution or keeps them in a cycle they cannot escape. A sovereign Scotland would need to design a welfare model that supports people without disabling their capacity to build futures. And then there is education. Scotland has always carried a deep pride in its intellectual heritage, yet our current educational outcomes are not consistently setting people up for long-term success. Sovereignty requires a population that is educated, skilled, adaptable and emotionally resilient. It requires systems that nurture potential, not simply process young people through curriculums. And we must not overlook the emotional reality that lives inside all of this, the feeling many people have that Scotland is stuck, that things do not move, that systems don't respond, that effort is not rewarded. This emotional climate influences productivity, health, well-being and social cohesion. A sovereign nation needs a population that feels energised, included, respected and capable. Without this, the structural elements of sovereignty cannot hold. So when we talk about internal pressures, we are not just talking about numbers or statistics. We are talking about the lived experience of millions of people, their health, their hopes, their opportunities and their sense of agency. And sovereignty, if it ever becomes a future option for Scotland, must be built on the well-being of the people who would carry it. That is why, as we move forward, we will continue to weave together the practical and the emotional. Because a strong nation is not built by systems alone. It is built by the people who feel well enough, capable enough, valued and engaged enough. And that human reality is just as important as any financial calculation. Before we go any further, I want to be absolutely clear about my stance and the purpose of this series, which is about preparing Scotland and not persuading it. This series is not pro-independence. This series is not pro-union. This series is pro-truth. My intention is not to convince you of a direction. My intention is to help Scotland understand itself, financially, structurally, emotionally and historically, so that whatever choice is made in the future is made from competence rather than confusion. My belief is simple. Scotland must become financially competent inside the Union before it can choose whether to stay or leave, not because Westminster says so, but because sovereignty has requirements. Independence is a choice, sovereignty is a capacity, and the capacity must come first. This series is about building that capacity in understanding, not in conclusion. So, for the overview of the series and what we will explore together, over the coming episodes we will step thoughtfully through the pieces that make a nation strong. We will look at how money actually works, the real cost of running a country, Scotland's current financial position, greed, inequality and systemic extraction, housing, land ownership and basic needs, energy beyond wind turbines into innovation and sovereignty, what a fair tax system looks like in practice, how to close the economic leaks draining Scotland's wealth, the institutions Scotland would need to build to become sovereign, long-term planning, 5 to 100 years, maybe even 1,000 years, not election cycles, and how Scotland could become a model for reform across the entire UK, and finally the conditions required for independence to become truly viable. This isn't a dramatic or emotional journey, it's a practical one, a grown-up one, a mature one, a Scotland-shaped one. So, as we begin this series, I want to offer you something. You don't have to want independence. You don't have to oppose it. You don't have to take a position today, tomorrow, or ever. All I'm asking you is that you join me in looking at the truth, without fear to talk openly, without pressure to side with other people's opinions, and without the emotional noise that so often clouds these conversations. A country that understands itself is a country with choices, and the choice is the beginning of all strength. Next time we start at the beginning and the thing that shapes everything else. What money really is, how it flows, how it's made, and why any conversation about sovereignty must start with the truth of the monetary system.